Really? You want to check?
It might just have to do. It might just have to go off of this audio.
Yeah. No. Check.
I don't know why it shows it's red. It should be green saying you're connected.
Oh, did I mute it? Let's see. No, I did not mute it. Do you want to try to switch over to B?
It's not charged.
Oh, okay.
Only my A is charged.
So weird.
Yeah, I don't know why.
Oh, really?
Starts at 8. Testing. No microphone. We're going to go ahead and get started while we're figuring out the microphone. I just hope that I can project for you to hear and we can get started quicker. We are Citizens for Constitutional Government. We're so glad that you're here helping support our efforts to help educate the citizenry in this republic that we have. We're so excited that you're here and wanting to learn. We are recording this and we'll send it out via our text subscription line. So if you're already a member of that, then you probably get our recordings after each speaker. If you're not on our text subscription line, then you can text. I won't tell you now because you won't have it, but we have our cards up here that tells you what number to text and what to text, and you'll find out about our future guest speakers. And that's how we do it. We run 100% off of your donations and a few big sponsors. So we're going to, I would like to thank Dixie Chiropractic and Southwest Exterminators, Hampton Inn and Suites, the Kate Daly Radio Show, and for their major donations that they give to us to help this running. To supplement that, we ask donations from you guys because 100% of your donations go to help fund getting speakers here for the venue, for the whatever it costs. And so we'd really like to have you fill. Norman, can you take those two and go to the back of the room? We're going to start the donation buckets in the back. You can either put cash in or scan the Venmo code and pay with Venmo. We would really appreciate your donations. Also, one last thing before we go. We are selling t-shirts as a little money maker. The t-shirts that we're selling are the super coolest. I wear mine. Oh, it's so dirty, it's gross. It says, "Stop the spread," and inside a virus, there's the communist symbol. So you can order, they're just $20 a piece and it fits like a normal t-shirt. You can have that on the front. And if you would like something on the back, I have on the back of mine, "We were never a democracy." And so you can have that same logo on the back, or you can choose to say, "We were never a democracy." And so just fill this out and I'll get this order in tonight after everyone fills it out. So where did Eric go with the clipboard? My helper's everywhere. We'll just pass these around and fill it out if you'd like me to place an order for you, and you can pay on Venmo. On the very last page is a Venmo scan code, but if you don't have Venmo, just find me and you can pay cash and we'll go that way. Okay, so I would like to introduce to you our guest speaker today. He is an international journalist, an educator, an author, and a consultant. He has been in, I don't know how many countries, and speaks a few languages. I have forgotten the big number. He has, you might have heard him on Breitbart or Fox, Freedom Project Media, Epoch Times, The New American, or most recently on Kate Dalley today. He has 5 young children that he left at home to come speak to us, and I am so grateful having a family of my own that he is willing to come and spend time. He's on a tour starting here and heading north. And so we're the first stop on his spot. So I'd like to introduce to you and turn the time over to Alex Newman.
Thank you so much for being here. It's really wonderful to see so many great people here. It's wonderful to be back in St. George. I was here earlier this year, and you guys are awesome. Starting with some weird news. You know, my grandpa is one of those lifelong Republicans. You know, the mic's not working. Hello. Check, check. Uh-oh, now we lost power completely. All right, 1 second before I continue my joke. Check, check. Still no. Check, check. Check, check. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I would try without mics, but then I'll be out of voice by the time we get done tonight. So.
Alex, I think it's true a little. You stand up and say,
Hello, is it working a little? A little? Do I need to turn the volume up, dude? Is it getting any louder? No. Yes.
speak louder.
Check, 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 check. Yeah. Okay. Now we'll wait for the tech people to come so that I don't lose my voice before we finish. Okay, they're sending someone. All right, let's see. Can you guys in the back hear me if I talk real loud to start with? Yeah, you can. Okay, well, maybe we'll start with that and then we'll wait for them to come and fix this, and hopefully that'll be soon. So anyways, I was saying my grandpa, one of those lifelong Republicans, he doesn't even bother, researching the candidates before the election. It's just, if he's got an R next to his name, he'll vote for him. And it was like that all his life. And then 2020 suddenly comes along and he pulls the lever for Joe Biden. I know, it's crazy. That's what we said. Our family's like, what in the world has happened to grandpa? That is really weird. So we had an emergency meeting, and we of course, we discussed this thoroughly, and we all agreed that this never would have happened if grandpa was still alive. And we need to keep saying that they stole the election, regardless of what the media says. They stole the election everywhere. I mean, it's so obvious. But the reality is, folks, they're not going to need to steal elections within a generation if we're not careful. Because here's the data on my generation. It's so-called millennials. And obviously, that's terribly embarrassing to admit you're a millennial, because then everybody knows you're a moron. But this is the polling data right here, guys. 70% of millennials describe themselves as socialists. So give it a generation and we will be Venezuela in no time, maybe Cuba shortly after that. This is what the polling data shows, and it didn't happen by accident. On the religious front, the situation is equally alarming, if not more so. For the first time in all of American history, millennials are now the first generation ever where a majority describes themselves as non-Christian. Never happened before in America. From a nation of 99.5% Christian down to millennials, a minority say they're Christian. And if you actually talk to them, you'll find that even a minority of those are actual Christians. So we have check. Still no. All right, what? You guys in the back can still hear me while we practice? Okay, cool. So we have a serious problem. If you look at the political polling data, The vast majority of our young people want the government to run their healthcare. They want open borders. And speaking of socialism and communism, they don't teach the kids this anymore, but that man right there on the top of the screen, Adolf Hitler, was the leader of the National Socialist Party, which means he was wrong about virtually everything. But he was right about one thing, right? Even a broken clock is right twice a day. And this is what he said, and this actually came up at the Nuremberg trial. It's one of those real quotes. He said that he alone who owns the youth gains the future. And see, a lot of people don't realize that was the central element of Adolf Hitler's strategy to build his 1,000-year Reich. Yeah, he had the big war machine, he had highly disciplined troops, he had good technology, but ultimately he understood that the way to own the future is to own the minds of the youth. So he became the first world leader in all of human history to criminalize homeschooling. True story. And then it wasn't enough to just herd all the children into the brainwash camps for 5 days a week for 7 hours a day. Then he insisted they had to participate in the Hitler Youth so that they would understand the glorious benefits of this wonderful Reich. And folks, we're seeing the exact same strategy being pursued here in our country right now. They want to drive a wedge between parents and children. They want to interrupt the transmission of values and culture and traditions from one generation to the next. They're being incredibly successful, and now they've even come out of the closet. They're admitting what they're doing. I'm going to show you a video from, I call it MSLSD. Other people know it as MSNBC, but their name is Melissa Harris Perry. Listen to this lady.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
All right, so kids belong to the whole community. Are we clear? If she just said it with a German accent, I think the implications would have been much more clear. But guys, this is where we're headed. Okay, this came out during the Obama administration. It's a policy document, and the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education, in their wonderful generosity, decided that you could be equal partners with them in the raising of your own children. And if you read the fine print, you'll realize very quickly they don't mean equal partners at all. You get to be the junior partner as long as you submit to home visits, home inspections. If you don't do what they say, you need mandatory parenting classes. If you still won't do what they say, then they move up the escalation ladder of interventions. And they say, then we're just going to have to take your kids. We're going to have to send CPS to your house, and we will take over all of the duties. You can forget this equal partnership. And guys, they're very open about this. I'm going to show you a video of Arne Duncan from the Biden regime. He was 7 years Secretary of Education under Obama. And listen to what he said. It's very creepy.
Certain kids we should have 24/7 to really create a safe environment and give them a chance. I think all of our schools should be community centers. Our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day with a wide variety of after school.
So some of the kids we should have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the rest of the kids, we need to get them for after school programming, 13, 14, 15 hours a day, right? And if you look at what they're doing, guys, this is already happening. They've set up this network of, they call them full service community schools. And really parents can kind of do the bedtime stories, but that's it. Dental health, mental health, nutrition, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The government's going to handle all of it for you. You just be good and give them a kiss before you put them to bed. Now, they've been out of the closet on this for a while. Hillary Clinton, you guys might remember, over 2 decades ago, published a book on the village that it supposedly takes to raise a child. And if you read the book, you quickly realize that they don't mean a village in the sense that any normal person would understand. They mean the government village. Highly trained professionals and bureaucrats will raise your children for you. Okay, and so they're telling us all this, and it's happening, and people are asleep at the wheel, and we continue allowing this until we find ourselves at their final agenda. So before I get into the specifics of what they're doing, I want to show you that there is an ultimate agenda, guys. They do have a plan. We'll learn a lot more about that plan in the next talk, which will happen 10 minutes after we finish with this one. But I want to give you a sneak preview. Some of you probably remember President George H.W. Bush. He went on national TV and he laid it all out for everybody. Here he is.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founding.
All right, so I mean, we could spend a week just talking about that one speech, but there's a lot there, right? A world where the rule of law will govern the conduct of nations. He's talking about a global legal system, a world in which the United Nations can use, a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role. He's talking about their military forces, the goobers with the blue helmets, famous around the world for raping women and children. We're going to use the UN's peacekeeping forces to implement the vision of the UN's founders. And that's a very revealing statement too. We know about our founders. They said some pretty smart things. God created us all equally. God gave us rights. Do we have Mike? No. Well, what about the UN's founders? We know some about them as well. On one side of the table, you had Joseph Stalin's minion. His name was Mr. Molotov. That's the guy who signed the agreement with Adolf Hitler. You enslave this half of Europe, we'll enslave this half, and we can be friends. And so they did that until Hitler invaded, and then that partnership went sour. So he was on one side of the table, representing the interests of one of the most murderous dictatorships to have ever been on this planet. And then on our side of the table, we sent this guy, Alger Hiss. Some of you are nodding your heads because you've heard the term before. So this was a guy, he was supposedly working for our State Department, and they really, really liked him. That should have been our first clue that something was wrong. They made him the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter. Then they made him the first Secretary General of the United Nations. And then we prosecuted him and threw him in federal prison because we found out he was a spy for Joseph Stalin. So those are the founders of the United Nations. Now, what kind of people would want to use the UN's military forces to bring about the vision of the UN's founders? We'll learn more about that. And I do want to make clear, I'm not picking on Republicans. This is a fully bipartisan problem. Here's Bill Clinton.
In 1989, President Bush said, and it's phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
All right, so Bill Clinton agrees. Beijing Biden.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
So they're very clear, right? They all agree. All the swamp creatures agree. We need a new world order. And there's a very simple formula if you want to know where these people fall on every issue all the time. And as we'll see, this is what they're teaching your children. Just take what God teaches in the Bible, flip it as far upside down as you possibly can, and there you go. That's the formula. Works every issue, every time. Things that we couldn't have even imagined would have become issues some years ago. Like, God created the male and female. I mean, you don't have to be a Bible scholar to recognize that. You can just study biology 101. Well, now they're teaching our children that if you say that, you're bigoted, you're hateful, you're a transphobe, things like this. And on every issue, what you'll find is the same thing, right? God said he created marriage, man, woman, lifelong relationship. Oh, no, that's old-fashioned bigotry. Now marriage could be 3 guys and a cat, and that's what the Supreme Court said. So who are you to question? Right? God said he created nations, so now they teach our children that borders are racist. God is the author of liberty, so now we see them waging war on liberty. And the remarkable thing about all of this, guys, is that they admit that they're using the Adolf Hitler strategy to bring about their new world order. You can read their own documents and international agreements, and you'll see that this is what's going on. So some of you might watch CNN, and I don't recommend it. It's pump raw sewage into your brain. Don't do it. But just in case, you've probably heard that Agenda 21 is a conspiracy theory. In fact, it's a ridiculous conspiracy theory by far-right, kooky extremists, etc. So just to knock that out of the way, in case anybody watches CNN, here's Mr. Bush.
Signed a climate convention, and the importance of economic instruments and free markets were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration. Let me be clear.
All right, so it's not a conspiracy theory. Either CNN is lying or they need a dictionary. Well, it turns out the Communist Party, here's the leader of the Communist Party in Congress, they agree. Agenda 21 is awesome.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. HCON Res 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21.
Anyways, that's enough financial. But so we need a comprehensive national strategy in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21. Isn't that interesting? Why did CNN say it was a conspiracy theory? Somebody should have. Well, anyway, just a quick summary. Here's what the UN says Agenda 21 is. It's an array of actions intended to be implemented by every person on the planet. Effective execution, by the way, is going to require, in their words, a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. These are big changes they have in mind, folks. And you guys are the bitter clingers. Remember Obama called you the bitter clingers? Clinging to your guns and Bibles. How dare you, bitter clinger? So they know this is going to take some pretty serious attitude adjustment. How are we going to get this profound reorientation? Well, they'll tell you, go to chapter 36 of Agenda 21, and the answers are right there. Education is critical for promoting this agenda. It's indispensable to changing people's attitudes. This is right in the text. You can read it on the UN's website, signed by George Bush for the United States and every other world leader in the world. They go on to say in the Agenda 21 document, it's critical. Education is critical for giving children the right values, attitude, the ethical awareness that'll be consistent with this. And they say it's got to include spiritual development. So hold that in the back of your mind. We'll come back to what they mean by spiritual development. They don't mean teaching your kids the 10 Commandments or the Lord's Prayer or the Golden Rule, nothing like that. And they say it needs to be integrated into all disciplines. So here's what it looks like in the classroom. This is Agenda 21 for children. It's called Rescue Mission Planet Earth, the children's edition of Agenda 21. It's produced by the United Nations, and it's being used in classrooms all over the world. I have a copy in my office. You should read it. It's an abomination. And here's one page. This one got me really upset because, you know, I've got 5 kids at home. You see some deities, they're hanging out on the cloud, and they're obviously very upset. And because all these storks are delivering all these babies. And then on the next page, they tell you why the deities are so upset. This is a direct quote from the book. The earth groans every time it registers another birth. What does God say? The very first command was be fruitful and multiply. Then he said, your children are a blessing. They're a heritage from the Lord. So what do they teach our kids? Oh, Mother Earth is groaning every time you have one of those useless eaters, and plus they're bad for the climate. So stop. Okay. This is what they're teaching our kids. Remember the formula. What does the Bible teach? Flip it upside down, and that's what they're going to teach our children. And you'll see it applies on every issue all the time. Now, in 2015, Obama went to the UN and they created Agenda 2030. It turns out the communist Chinese dictatorship, the most murderous government that has ever existed in human history, took credit for it. I kid you not. But Obama signed us up for it. Everybody had a big party. And they say right in the introduction, your children, this is in the preamble, your children will be the critical agents of change to bring in this wonderful new world using these 17 sustainable development goals. And that sounds cute until you realize what they mean by a better world. So sneak preview, goal number 10, they got 17 of them. National socialism, AKA Nazism, not enough anymore. Now we need international socialism. They say we got to reduce inequality within and among countries. Okay, so we got to have global wealth redistribution. And they say it's only possible if the wealth is shared. Oh, thank you. And income inequality. Oh, that's much better. Now I don't have to scream. Thank you, sir. What does God say? He says, thou shalt not steal, right? What do these people say? Well, you know, resources are not properly distributed, so we have to redistribute those. And of course, to do that, we have to steal. But, you know, it's for the greater good. So what are you going to do? So that's what they're talking about. They're very open about it. You keep going, you say they got to change the way we produce and consume goods. You go to goal number 4, and there's the sneak recipe, the strategy for how they're going to make this happen. By 2030, all of your children need to be so brainwashed, they won't just passively submit to this maniacal agenda. They will actually promote it, is the word they use in the text. Now, they're making videos bragging about this. This isn't Alex Newman, St. George telling you this. This is them telling you. I pulled this video right off the UN website. Watch.
Achieve sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education. We can't. Sustainable development begins with education.
Begins with education.
Global education first.
Not just any education. You got to put global education first. We'll come back to that before we finish today. But first, I want to show you how good they are at this. They've got 100 years of psychological research. How do you transform the attitudes and values of a child? They're masters of it. Now, in the early 1990s, if I had told you that we would be celebrating so-called homosexual marriages within a generation, you would have laughed at me. You might have called me an extremist or a kook. You might have even called the guys with the little white lab coats to put me in a rubber room. That's crazy. Sodomy was still a crime across virtually the entire United States. The Supreme Court didn't strike down our sodomy laws until 2001. What do you mean homosexual marriage? Ridiculous. Well, let me show you what they showed your children. 1991, 1992, 93, 94, they showed this little documentary they had made called It's Elementary, talking about gay issues at school. Here's a clip from that documentary.
Let me tell you quickly the backgrounds. Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, that it goes against what a family is.
That's the argument.
Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should gays be allowed to marry? Should they not?
So now the 5 minutes of obligatory peer pressure, all the little kids, oh yeah, how mean. And look at the way they presented the argument, right? Well, there's some people that don't think gays should be allowed to get married. They just don't think it good. They think it goes against what a family is. Right? What does the Bible say about marriage? It's a representation of the relationship between Christ and the church. It's a holy union designed to bring children into the world so that they can be raised up in the fear and the admonition of the Lord, to bring a man and a woman together so they can become one flesh. That's not what they taught the children. Oh, there's just some people, you know, those old-fashioned bigots. And I mean, look, it took a while, right? They asked the people of California, hey, what do you guys think? Should we have homosexual marriages? And even in the land of fruits and nuts, they're like, nope, we're good. God's definition is adequate. Thank you. Even in California, they couldn't do this on the ballot. So what did they do? They prepared the children. Let's be pretend judges, guys. Let's be pretend judges. What did they do? The pretend judges on our Supreme Court struck down our marriage laws, and then you see our White House lit up in rainbow colors. Fast forward, now we're here. Okay, this is the drag queen story hour, they call it. Obviously, that's a man wearing a dress and some demon horns, so you know where it came from. Obviously, straight from the pit of hell. And they go into classrooms all over America. They brag about this. So first graders, they love the LGBT stories where we're teaching them to be more tolerant by wearing demon horns in the classroom, right? And I mean, I could show you videos of this stuff you wouldn't believe. These perverts rolling around on the floor with kids, barking like dogs. They found several of them who are convicted sex offenders. They're going into school classrooms. That's America. Here we go. The Portland Public Schools marching around in a pride parade. They were walking our dogs. I don't know why. And now they got another pet issue, and there's tons of these issues we could spend time on, but I want to show you another good one. I've been following this for over a decade. I've been going to the UN's climate summits or whatever. And they're teaching the children. I mean, you guys probably remember when we were children, we learned that carbon dioxide was the gas of life. You exhale about 2 pounds of it every single day, and the trees use it for photosynthesis, and then they release oxygen. It's this beautiful cycle. In fact, I interviewed Trump's climate advisor, Dr. Will Happer. He's a physics professor at Princeton University. He says the Earth is starving for more CO2. He says plants are designed, is the word he used. It was interesting, to live in an atmosphere with 4 to 5 times as much CO2 as we have right now. Anybody who wants to reduce the amount of CO2 in the planet, I mean, they must be suicidal. What do we want to kill all the plants and then all the people? That's crazy talk, right? But watch what they're teaching the kids, right? They're not teaching the kids anymore that it's the gas of life. They're teaching them that it's a dangerous, toxic pollution, and that we need to let the UN regulate and tax it. So think about the implications of that for a minute, right? From a scientific perspective, the idea that CO2 is pollution is beyond ludicrous. It's absurd. But from a totalitarian perspective, if CO2 is pollution, there is nothing you can do. You can't eat, you can't breathe, you can't die, you can't turn on a light switch, you can't turn on your car ignition. There's nothing you can do that wouldn't then fall under the purview of this polluting thing. So here's what they're doing to the kids in the classrooms.
You've heard the reports. The globe's warming. It's our fault, and the consequences will be terrible. Children are frightened.
I worry. My mom worries.
Who does this to kids?
And it might flood the whole town. We won't be able to survive for a while.
What are you most worried will happen?
They'll all die.
Are there some people who say this isn't true?
Yes.
Might they be right?
No.
How do you know they're not right?
Well, because
They're brainwashed.
hotter.
Where do you learn this?
See, I know this looks like a doomsday cult, and you expect Jim Jones to just hop out, but it's actually a public school in Florida.
One of the main components after educating the students of global warming is that they're given a letter for their families to sign, and then it's to the congressman or woman.
All right, so you brainwash them, then you give them a letter to sign for their congressman so that they'll demand global regulations on the gas of life. Okay, true story. Now, a lot of people still have this idea that we're sending our children to school to learn how to read and write and do math. Well, I want to introduce you to Shirley McCoon, very obscure individual, but here she is speaking to the nation's 50 governors. And she was hired by the Department of Education back in the late 80s to start working on national standards that they plan to impose on America. True story. And here she's talking about this plan at a summit convened by George H.W. Bush. And listen what she says.
To fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society. What is happening in America?
A total restructuring of the society. Interesting. And then she goes on to say that we're talking about total transformation. Now listen to the role of the schools in this process.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is and then move back and figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of school.
Anticipatory socialization, the social change function of schools. How many parents do you think suspect that there's a social change function to the schools they're sending their children to, right? And you want to know what kind of social change? Read her book, okay? She co-wrote this book called The Light Shall Set You Free, and it's not what you're thinking. She claims to be in communication with these spiritual beings that she describes as ascended masters, and they're giving her secret revelations about what you need to be able to enter the 5th dimension in the new age. And if you've read your Bible, you know she's not talking to ascended masters, okay? So what does this social change function look like? Well, in Minnesota, and we're just going to look at the very, very tippy top of the iceberg here, but in Minnesota, the equal partner in this relationship decided they knew better than the parents, right? The boy said, "Mom, can I have a sex change?" And she said, "No, honey, that's crazy. Get on the bus." So the other equal partner here, the government school, said, "Well, your mommy doesn't know what she's talking about." So they took this child to a medical facility, and I use that term very loosely, and without getting too graphic, they gave him what they call a sex change operation. Obviously irreversible. I went to federal court. She said, "Hey, they violated my parental rights." They said, "No, sorry." So even if they had ruled that they violated the parental rights, what are you going to do? You can't reattach the pieces parts, right? But it gives you a sense of what's going on in these schools. They are grooming the children for this. I pulled this off the Department of Education website in California. It's called a gender transition plan. It's a form for children to fill out. And it asks, what gender do you identify as? What name should we call you? Are your parents okay with this? Because don't worry, if they're not, we'll just, we'll pretend like you're a boy when you're here, and we'll call you whatever name we're supposed to. And then, do you need medical treatment? Do we need to start working on getting you hormones and things like this? And by the way, we'll hide that from your parents too. And so I was giving this talk in a very rural, very conservative county in Florida, and some of the members of the school board were there, and they came up to me after and they said, "Alex, that's here too." Okay. And then I gave this talk a few weeks ago in Michigan, and members of the school board were there. They said, "That's here too." So coast to coast, they are giving children these gender transition plans to help them become a new gender. So one day your son or your daughter might come home and they're not your son or your daughter anymore, okay? At least in their mind. Now, in California, this is what they had in the health education framework for 5-year-olds. Who are you? The Kid's Guide to Gender Identity. And they say there's infinite gender. That silly stuff about 2 genders that God said, that's baloney. We're much more sophisticated now. You can be agender, bigender, trigender, Newton's law, free spirit, things I can't even pronounce, and you get to choose. No one can tell you otherwise. This is what they had for 9th graders. Everything you need to know about sex in your teens and 20s, and some of the stuff there is so grotesque you can't even mention it. Some of you probably heard of the National Education Association, the NEA, largest union in America. They've got more than 3 million members. The overwhelming majority of government school teachers in America are members. And they partnered, of course, with the Human Rights Campaign, the most vicious LGBT organization in this country. They're the ones behind the Equality Act, where if you won't, bend the knee to the golden idol of LGBTism, they'll come and take down your church. Well, here's what this partnership came up with. They sent this to all their members by email, and some teachers sent it to me. Listen. How to make a welcoming, inclusive school.
Hi, your name is Emma, correct? And my name is Zine. What pronouns do you use?
I use she, they, them. What pronouns do you use?
I use they, them, and also just Z. And so instead of being a boy or a girl or something undefined or in the middle, I kind of like, just use my name. My name is Zine. So if you just use Z instead of a pronoun, it's like more personalized and like less fitting into a binary. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And just for future reference, guys, my pronouns are Your Royal Majesty Supreme Emperor. And don't you dare misgender me. I'll be on the phone with my lawyer. Now, if you guys want to see how ubiquitous this is, like they're talking about educating their teachers on this.
You said it's cool when teachers ask pronouns. That was never a thing when I was like in elementary school or even middle school. Did you find that you had to like ask for that or like even educate your teachers?
Well, when I had a substitute, sometimes I had to.
Yeah, only when there was a substitute. All the other teachers know that you, hi children, what's your name and what are your pronouns? And I mean, if you think this isn't happening, do some FOIA requests for your local school district and you'll find the principal and the superintendent, they're all, you know, like their little signature at the bottom, principal, whatever, he, him, her, whatever, right? Their pronouns. This is ubiquitous, guys. Now in California, it's working really well too. It's really effective. When I was a kid, I grew up in 8 different countries on 4 different continents with every kind of child you could imagine, every color, every creed, every background, everything. Never in my whole childhood did I once meet a boy who didn't recognize that he was a boy. It just was unheard of. Or a girl who didn't understand that she was a girl. Just was completely unheard of. The word transgender wasn't even in the dictionary. I mean, there were some weird guys that like to wear high heels and they do that in the privacy of their homes, but nothing like this, right? Well, according to the UCLA, they did a survey of children in California. 27% of California's children ages 12 through 17, this was a couple of years ago, it's probably worse now, describe themselves as gender non-conforming. So the boys who don't accept that they're boys, girls who don't accept that they're girls. Right? That's what this is doing. And at what point do we say stop? Do we wait until half of our children are gender non-conforming and they've mutilated themselves and injected themselves with testosterone or estrogen or whatever it is? Okay. And you're thinking, well, that doesn't affect me in Utah. Oh, I was here a couple of years ago and some very kind people in this state gave me some data from your state medical license or medical prescriptions database. And here's what they found. A 10,000% increase in the number of minor girls under 18 who are going through what they call medical transitions. So these are girls who are being prescribed puberty blockers, testosterone to give them a deep voice. Of course, this sterilizes them. They'll never be able to have children. And this is all in preparation, of course, for the surgical mutilation. This is Utah, folks, 10,000% increase in 5 years. And it's not something in the water. Hollyweird plays kind of a backup role as air support. But the real way that this is coming into the minds and hearts of our children is through the public schools. And it gets even crazier. Okay? This is California, land of fruits and nuts, but it's going to happen everywhere. It's already started. So long story short, in 2016, the California Assembly passed a law saying that all the kids in the government schools had to learn about the wonderful history of LGBTism. And so they started off at Harvey Milk. I actually got a copy of the curriculum. The mom, who you're going to hear in just a minute, confronting this official, sent me the curriculum. They start off with Harvey Milk, the supposed pioneer of the LGBT revolution. They don't tell the kids that he was a child rapist and that some of his victims killed themselves, or that he was a good buddy with Jim Jones, Mr. Kool-Aid. They don't tell the kids that. But you go on in this program that they're teaching the kids, and they go to ancient Greece, and they just casually throw it out there. Oh yeah, you know, ancient Greek men, they used to have sexual relations with underage boys, minor boys. No big deal. Okay, and so this mom, you're going to hear her in a minute, goes and confronts the assistant superintendent of curricula for this school district. Says, what are you teaching my kids about pedophilia for? What's wrong with you? Listen carefully to what she says.
You're teaching pedophilia. Pedophilia right here.
University is absolutely twice my admin to come to view the material and explain to you that this is done because you're talking from historical perspectives of how gender relations and different types of sexual orientations have existed in history. So this is something that's occurred in history, and so this is really important for us to impact.
Come on, guys, quit being so prude. It's just a different sexual orientation that existed in history. Right? And I mean, we all recognize it would be insane to put a pedophile in charge of the Sunday school ministry or the kindergarten. But what happens when these kids grow up? And they've been taught that being a pedophile is just a different sexual orientation. When this video was made, it was already against the law in California and 26 other states to quote unquote discriminate against someone based on their sexual orientation. Now, thanks to the pretend judges on the Supreme Court, it's illegal in all 50 states. So what's going to happen? Just, connect the dots. Where does this lead? Well, here you have on the classroom board, pedophilia as a sexual orientation. Just like they groomed the children so that the pretend judges would accept homosexual marriage, now they're doing it with pedophilia. UNESCO, the UN's education agency, you should read this and have a barf bag handy. This is their international technical guidance on sex education, global sex ed standards. A lot of it is so sick, I couldn't even dream of mentioning it to you. Again, read it yourself. But just some sneak previews at the youngest age, 5-year-olds need to understand masturbation. They need to understand male and female responses to stimuli. And I can't go any deeper than that's what 5-year-olds learn. And if you're uncomfortable, you should be. How do you think your kids feel? Right? I've got a 5-year-old at home. Anybody teaches them this stuff, we're going to have a major, major problem. And that's what the 5-year-olds learn. By the time they're 9, they need to understand that abortions need to be funded by taxpayers, and on and on. And it all goes back to this sicko right here, Alfred Kinsey. And without getting too much into the disgusting details, he did a bunch of so-called sex research funded by the CIA and the Rockefeller Foundation back in the 40s. And he published his results, and he published his methodologies and charts. And in a book they published in 1948 called Sexuality of the Human Male, he had 3 charts. And in these charts, he had the data that he and a group of pedophiles had obtained by doing horrifying things to children, some as young as 5 months old. And they concluded that children are sexual beings from birth because they liked this. And that is the root of sex education. They figured out that the best way to break up the family and to interrupt the transmission process of values and religion and culture from one generation to the next was to promote this promiscuity. They did it in Hungary, they did it all over the place, and it all goes back to the research by this disgusting piece of filth, and I don't use those terms lightly. Now, the foundations that funded this guy and have been at the heart of these issues for decades have been up to something for a long time. Congress actually got really suspicious in the early 1950s, and they put together a select committee to find out what was going on. Like, why are these guys seemingly promoting communism? And their final report, it was called the Reese Committee, the Select Committee to Investigate Tax-Exempt Foundations, they concluded that there had been a revolution in the United States. And they talked about the revolution as being in the past tense, early 1950s. And they said this revolution could not have occurred peacefully or without the consent of the majority unless education in the United States had prepared the way in advance to endorse it. And I want to introduce you now to the chief investigator for this committee. His name is Norman Dodd. You see his picture right there. He's a lead investigator, and he was invited into the office of Alan Geither, the head of the Ford Foundation at the time. And Alan Geither invites him in and says, hey, you want to know what we're up to? You don't have to do all this investigation. I'll tell you. Here's what the chief investigator said he was told by the head of the Ford Foundation.
I'd like very much to know. Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, Mr. Dodd, we operate on similar, in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union.
So the foundations were using their grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that we could be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. That's interesting. The Carnegie Foundation was one of the biggest foundations that was involved in this. Remember we talked about Alger Hiss earlier? Before he went to go represent the United States at the conference that founded the UN, he was running the Carnegie Foundation, hijacking our schools. And it all goes back full circle. Now again, this idea that our children are learning how to read, write, and do math, nothing could be further from the truth. So you guys have heard of Common Core. They put 2 subject matter experts on the validation committee. Sandra Stotsky, the English expert, said, I'm not going to sign off. You're going to reduce the thinking abilities of children. You're taking out all the great literature. We're not going to do it. The only math expert, Dr. James Milgram of Stanford, said, I'm not signing off on this. It's as non-challenging as possible, extremely serious failings. There are actual errors in the math. I'm not signing off on that garbage. So they just wiped their names off the website, had no subject matter experts, and validated it anyway. Okay, now the federal government knows it's making your kids dumber. They funded a study by CSAIL. They found significant negative effects after Common Core was implemented, and the magnitude of the negative effects is getting worse as time goes by. The same geniuses that brought you Common Core now have a national science standards. It's called the Next Generation Pseudoscience Standards. I added the pseudo in there. And you'd probably be surprised to know that in 12 years of so-called science lessons, you'll never hear the term scientific method. Can you imagine 12 years of science with no scientific method? Because if they heard the scientific method, they know there aren't infinite genders. They know the planet is not going to die because of the gas you exhale. And they know that they didn't come from slime over billions of years and there is no God. And those are the core elements of their science training. Now they've got massively fake history, nothing about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, except that it was written by dead white men who owned slaves. Instead, they learn this 1619 Project. America's real birthday is in 1619. That's the first year that slaves were brought to America. All of American history is about slavery. America is evil and oppressive. In fact, this lady here with the pink hair who wrote the 1619 Project, if you read the 1619 Project, she says this evil is embedded in the DNA of our country. And if it's embedded in the DNA of our country, there's nothing you can do to get rid of it, except maybe take an mRNA vaccine. No, just kidding. But so what's the solution? If the DNA, if you're evil in your very being, well, you can't reform, you can't pay enough reparations, you can't apologize, you just have to kill the patient, right? You just have to get rid of the toxic DNA. And that is what they're planning. The most used history book in the United States today, and by the way, they're teaching the 1619 Project in government schools all over America, along with A People's History of the United States, written by Howard Zinn, an actual member of the Communist Party USA. The whole thing is about how horrible America is. And it goes right into critical race theory. And you know, people think I'm just being inflammatory, but I'm really glad critical race theory is in the schools. You guys are like, what? And the reason why I'm glad is because America was driving over the cliff and the kids are sleeping in the back and we're headed right over the edge of the cliff, and suddenly critical race theory and parents are like, wait a minute, what's going on here? So now people are mad, and now people are out screaming at their school boards. And fun fact, I got a news report just before leaving the hotel today. The National Association of School Boards, she knows, is now asking the Biden regime to please use its terrorism laws to prosecute the parents that are out there screaming at the school boards. So yeah, don't you dare, right? You have no right to resist this madness. But I want to talk about critical race theory for a moment, for those who aren't familiar, and you probably have to be living under a rock to not be familiar. But what they do, this is actually just a reinvention of the Marxist class conflict strategy. Right? Marx believed that if you divided people up, what did Jesus say? A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. In fact, it'll be laid waste, it'll be brought to desolation. So Marx figured out, hey, we got to divide people, and a logical way to do that would be bourgeoisie and proletariat, the working class and the wealthy. Right? So that was his strategy, and it kind of worked in Russia because Russia was oppressive, semi-feudalistic. But then imagine trying that in America, where your worker is making $80,000 a year, he's got 3 weeks vacation, he's got full health care benefits, he lives in a 4,000 square foot house, he's got 2 fancy cars in the front, he's got 8 TVs in the house. You're oppressed. Really? I don't feel very oppressed. And I know if I work hard, I can move up the ladder. Maybe I could be a manager. Maybe one day I'll be an owner. Right? So that wasn't really a viable strategy for America. So we need to reinvent this. Let's do critical race theory. So we'll divide people up by race. And by the way, if you read your Bible, God uses the term race in this context 0 times. Just a side note. But so what they did is instead of bourgeoisie and proletariat, they said black and white. And now everybody ends white. And now they've added new categories. Now they've got cisgender and transgender. Cisgender, by the way, is you just accept that you're a man or a woman. And so what they tell these little kids in the schools is, well, you're white, that means you're an oppressor. But if you are transgender, then you get to be part of the oppressed class. So, you know, wink, wink, wink. Right? Or hey, homosexuals, they're part of the oppressed class too. So if you want to get out of the oppressor class and be part of the oppressed, you could just be transgender or homosexual, and presto, you're now a victim too. Okay, so that's how this works. And what happens? They get these kids at each other's throat. And the reason why they're doing it is the same reason Chairman Mao did it, right? He didn't use race. He divided people up into the red classes and the black classes. The red classes were the workers, the landless peasants, the revolutionary soldiers. The black classes were the Christians, the landowners, the business owners. And they started teaching this garbage to the children in the brainwash camps. And it didn't take more than a few years until the blood is running in the streets. Tens of millions of people are being slaughtered. Children are turning their parents into the communist authorities to get a bullet in the back of their head because, hey, they're oppressors. I don't want to be associated with that, right? And so, guys, if we think America is immune to this, we're kidding ourselves. And it's really interesting that they did this in America. After this, I'll stop on the critical race theory. But it's really interesting because America has a lot to be proud of. In fact, for all of human history, virtually every culture, every people group, every civilization in the history of humanity has had an institution called slavery. And then along come these guys and they say, wait a minute here. God created us all equally. The Bible says you can't enslave people, so we need to stop this. So we're going to create a Declaration of Independence that says we're all created equal. We're going to create a constitution. Well, we tried really hard. We can't quite ban slavery yet. And then guess what? Americans became the first people in the history of humanity to ban slavery. And some of you are thinking, William Wilberforce and the British did that. They got the idea from us. Many of our states banned slavery before the British did. We were the pioneers. 5,000, 6,000 years of recorded human history, slavery was practiced everywhere. Then along comes some people and say slavery is wrong, we're not going to do it. And suddenly we're the bad guys? Can you imagine? Slavery was still legal 50 years ago all over the Arabian Peninsula. It wasn't criminalized in Mauritania in Africa until 2007. And somehow America is the bad guy? Can you imagine the mental gymnastics that it takes, the propaganda that it takes to brainwash kids? All you really need to do is teach them real history. Problem is they won't accept it because they've been conditioned like Pavlov's dogs. Oh, that's racist. It's not racist, it's just true. Okay? But that's where we're at anyways. So again, this idea that we're sending our kids to learn how to read, write, and do math, don't believe me. Some of you don't even know me. Here's the federal government's own data. Less than 1/3 of our students are proficient in anything, according to the federal government's own statistics. Here is the Deputy Education Secretary confirming this.
The National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, which is called America's Report Card, reports that 2/3, get this, 2/3 of American 8th graders are not proficient in any core subject.
Same is true for 4th graders and 12th graders, by the way. And there's some school districts where there are multiple schools where they can't even produce one student who's proficient in anything. In anything. Can you imagine that? So imagine this in any other industry. Right? Imagine I set up a fast food stand and I advertise that I'm selling cheeseburgers. Who wants cheeseburgers? And less than 1/3 of the people who come to me get anything even remotely resembling a cheeseburger. A lot of you get like a decomposing rodent on some moldy bread. Like, wait a minute, I ordered a cheeseburger. Oh, well, you just have to give me more money. Right? And then I'll give you another moldy rodent. I mean, we all recognize this would be criminal, right? I'd be thrown in jail so quick her head would spin. And yet it's exactly what the government schools are doing. They promise that if we give them all our money, and in fact, they don't ask, they just say, we're going to steal your house if you don't fork over your money. But if you give us your money and then you give us your children, we're going to educate your children. And then by their own standards, the most dumbed down proficiency standards we've ever had, not even 1/3 of our kids are basic proficiency. Can you imagine that? This would never fly in any other industry. And yet when the government schools say, oh, do you just have to give us more money? We say, oh, yes, master, here you go. It's insane, guys. Here's what they're doing. There's a field trip to a mosque, the 5 pillars of Islam on a school board in Kansas. They're doing Buddhism in the classroom. They call it mindfulness education. They're doing Hinduism in the classroom. They call it yoga. You can read about some of the rituals they're doing in schools across America. It's crazy. They light the incense and they turn the lights down. They put a little Hindu figurine and they have the kids throw petals and chant things that they don't even understand. Happening everywhere. The newspapers are reporting it. I want to show you a Black Lives Matter teacher training program. We're going to summon spirits into the classroom. Watch.
I'm going to ask you to hold an ancestor in your head right now. Ancestors watching, I know they're watching. Ancestors watching, I know. Now call out your ancestors into the room. Loud so we can hear you.
Call out your ancestors into the room. Okay. That's what we do in Black Lives Matter class. Now, the Christian privilege stuff, you thought it was just going to stop at white privilege. No way. Christian privilege is next. They're already doing it. In North Carolina, they forced the little kids to stand up and confess their Christian privilege and apologize. In California, State Board of Education just approved unanimously new ethnic studies model curriculum where the children in elementary school need to chant and pray to these pagan Aztec deities of cannibalism, war, and human sacrifice. True story. They're supposed to ask for help with liberation, and they need to ask these deities for a critical consciousness. True story. And they do values. How do they get the kids to abandon their parents' values? How does this happen so quickly? Well, they brag that they can destroy everything parents have done in 15 years in an hour. And I'll show you how they did it because they did it to me. And it worked, okay, until God got me out of that mess. So here's how they did it. And the UN says this should be done in every school all over the world. They've been doing it in America since the 60s. They call it values clarification. And so they'll tell the kids, all right, kids, you're in a boat and your boat's sinking. And so 11 of you jump out into a life raft. But whoops, only 10 of you can actually fit there. So you've got a doctor and an engineer and a lawyer and a teacher, and don't you dare throw the teacher out or you're all failing. So let's see, guys, this one's 12 years old. This one's 57 years old. This one's pregnant. Who are we going to throw overboard? Who are we going to kill? Who are we going to murder for the greater good? The lawyer, obviously. Totally kidding. Totally kidding. There's great lawyers out there. But if the kids were thinking about this, they said, well, wait a minute, why do we have to murder somebody? I'll be the first to volunteer. I'll swim alongside the raft. I'll go for an hour or so, and then we just switch, right? And then you take your next turn. But no, you can't think that. You're supposed to say, well, which one has more value? And so what happens? The kids say, mom and dad said thou shalt not murder, and God said that, and the pastor said that. What do they know? They must have never considered this situation where the only ethical solution is for us to murder somebody. So see, mom and dad are dumb, the pastor is dumb. What does the Bible know? My teacher, though, she's a smart lady. So what happens? Their entire moral foundation has been obliterated with one silly exercise, where if they had just put their thinking caps on, they would have said, well, we don't have to murder anybody. That's crazy, right? Works very well, guys. That's how they get the kids to abandon their parents' views and values. Now, Ronald Reagan put together a commission. They said that the future of our nation and our people is at risk, is under threat by what we call education. They said that if an unfriendly foreign power had done this to us, we would have viewed it as an act of war. And I think to understand this, you need to understand where we fell from, okay? Because there was a time when Americans were by far the best educated people in the history of the world on this planet, bar none, without even a close second. Okay, John Adams wrote in a letter to a friend that a native of America who can't read or write is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. I mean, you might find one if you look real hard, but chances are low. Read the Federalist Papers. These were written for average Americans. Okay, shopkeepers, blacksmiths. These weren't for PhDs in political science. We've got a lot of data on literacy in early America. Here's a study that was done by DuPont de Nemours in 1812. Not more than 4 in 1,000 young Americans are unable to write legibly, even neatly. I bet you couldn't find 4 in 1,000 today who could write legibly, even neatly, right? You'd be surprised if you could find 4 who could write at all, okay? Now, this is what they used. 30-cent pamphlet, right? And they learned theology, they learned religion, they learned spelling, they learned reading, they learned writing, they learned moral character in a tiny little book. You should get a copy. They're amazing. They'd be banned today. Alexis de Tocqueville came over here and he was flabbergasted at the level of education. He had come from France. He said, oh my goodness, these people are so well educated. And guess what? We didn't have a single government school in this whole country, right? Pretty amazing. How did that happen? Okay, here's some of the data on what it looked like in Philadelphia. It's unbelievable. And then we got to this guy here, Robert Owen. He was a communist before Karl Marx even came along, set up a communist commune in Indiana that failed in less than 2 years because communism rejects biblical principles like private property, family, etc. And so when his communist commune failed, he came to the wrong conclusion. He didn't realize the reason it failed was because communism is dumb. He said it's because we couldn't brainwash the children from the time they were 2. Just let the government raise the children, and then our communist utopia will work. So he wrote all these essays about how the government should raise our children. And to be clear, this is the first guy who seriously proposed that the government ought to educate our children since Plato, the raging totalitarian who thought the philosopher kings should lord it over us for our own benefit. So he wrote these essays, and the Prussian ambassador got a hold of these essays and took them back to the dictator of Prussia. And according to his autobiography, the Prussian dictator so much approved of these ideas that he ordered his interior minister to create a national education system in Prussia based on these ideas. Well, they didn't take off in America. Obviously, people were getting a great education. Why should we let the government run our education? What does the Bible say about education? We'll get to that. So people didn't accept that idea. And so what he did was he formed a secret society. Robert Owen did. And we know because of a whistleblower who was part of the secret society. He met Christ and then he repented and then he blew the whistle. He said, guys, these guys are crazy. They're trying to create government schools, right? They're like, no, they would never do that, right? Yes, they would. Okay, and here's what he said. This is the whistleblower right here, Orestes Brownson. He said the great object of this was to get rid of Christianity. That was their main objective. And they sought to do that by organizing people, by shifting public opinion, and getting men elected to the legislature who would support this madness. Now, Horace Mann came along, and he said, hey, the Prussians are doing a great thing. We should do that in Massachusetts. So he imported the Prussian system to Massachusetts. Right away, the quackery came in. If you want to know why your kids can't read, it's because of the innovation that Horace Mann introduced in the schools in Boston, the whole word method. Basically, they teach the children to read words as if the word themselves were a symbol rather than a collection of symbols. Each letter is a symbol, represents one or more sounds. You got to blend them together. So Horace Mann said, hey, let's just teach them to memorize the whole word as if the word were a symbol. And obviously that didn't work. The schoolmasters in Boston said, look, we tried, that's done. We're not going to do it anymore. So John Dewey comes along 50 years later, the founding father of America's system of education. He went to the Soviet Union instead of Prussia for inspiration, and he loved what the mass murdering barbarians enslaving the Soviet Union were doing. And so he resurrected this whole word method that Horace Mann had brought in. You know, Horace Mann had tried to take the Bible out. Obviously, people were like, no, that's crazy. But John Dewey picked up where he left off. He resurrected this quack method of teaching reading, and he actually wrote an essay. I've got a reprinted in the back of the book here, Crimes of the Educators, that I co-wrote with Sam Blumenfeld, because it's so revealing. But we don't need to teach the kids how to read, write, and do math. We really need to teach them to be socialized. They need to be good little collectivists so that they can live in this new utopia. But change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So that's the language of a conspirator, right? So the Rockefellers gave him millions of dollars back when that was real money, set up an experimental school, graduated a bunch of kids that couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't tell right from wrong. They said, that will be perfect. Let's do that nationwide. So they did. Went to Columbia University. He was exposed several times along the way, right? The reason why your kids can't read, he said in 1955, because the teaching of reading all over the United States in all the schools and all the textbooks is totally wrong. It flies in the face of all logic and common sense. Now we have a neuroscience. We can do brain scans on the children who've been victimized by this. You can see their brains actually get wired wrong. You can see the physical damage. And so you're probably not surprised now that this is mandatory under Common Core. Get the kindergartners memorizing sight words. You can scramble their brains, right? Here's what it looks like. Now, John Dewey was also a very religious man, not in the sense that we might understand, but he co-wrote the Humanist Manifesto. And the very first tenet is religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. What does God say? In the beginning, God created. A real clear contrast, in case you couldn't tell. Now, you don't have to be a Bible scholar to understand this. Our founding fathers said it was a self-evident truth. Okay? They didn't think you had to be studying your Bible to recognize that God created you. Now, one of Dewey's cohorts, Charles Francis Potter, he wrote a book about how they were going to use the schools to spread their new false religion, humanism. So the public school would be the chief mechanism for spreading it. What is your silly Sunday school going to do for 1 hour a week with only a fraction of the children against our 5 days of humanistic teachings? Of course, the answer is nothing. Right? And now, if you're thinking about it, this religion, you probably realize is not new, right? The idea that man can be his own little God, we can all decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. We've heard that before. Now, the Supreme Court, believe it or not, established this as our national religion. In 1962, they said we couldn't have prayer. In 1963, they said we couldn't have Bibles in the school. They said the First Amendment required this. True story, because Congress, wait, what? The state of New York can't require prayer because Congress shall make no law? Huh, that was interesting. And now, keep in mind, when the First Amendment was written, most of our states had established churches. Most of our states. You think the men who wrote this planned to ban Bible and prayer in schools? Of course not, right? That's ludicrous. But one of the justices did understand what was going on. He said this refusal to permit religious exercises is seen thus not as the realization of a state of neutrality with respect to religion, but rather as the establishment of the religion of secularism. So they illegally, under the guise of stopping Congress from establishing a religion, established a false religion as the national religion. They forced you to pay for it, and they forced your children to learn it. Isn't that cute? So now we get to the globalization of education. They are absolutely globalizing the school system. By the way, I didn't mention the first ever Secretary General of the UN Education Agency, Julian Huxley, was also the head of the British Humanist Association and the head of the British Eugenics Society. A little fun fact. So you go on, and they're now openly telling you in their own international agreements they're going to use the school system to change the attitudes, values, behaviors of your children. What? Yikes. All right, let me go 5 minutes over. Okay, so here's the Secretary General of the UN.
Must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
Yeah, okay. So they brag in their 2016 agreement, it's got to shape the spirituality of your children. And we'll skip some of this in the interest of time. But this is Arnie Duncan again on global education.
Promote global citizenship by fostering mutual understanding and building long-term relationships.
So they're real big on this global education stuff, and including the people in our government. Arnie Duncan said UNESCO was his global partner. And the UN actually has what they call a World Core Curriculum. And the guy who wrote it, Robert Mueller, he says it needs to be taught in every school in the world. And there's a really revealing statement in the teacher's manual. He says that the underlying philosophy upon which it's based can be found in the teachings of the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Djwhal Khul. And you're probably wondering, Alice who? Well, hint, she was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. True story. Dead giveaway. Now they call it the Lucis Trust because it was just a little too obvious. And this Tibetan teacher. Turns out he's not Tibetan, he's not a teacher, he's actually not even a human being. Remember the Ascended Masters we met earlier? Alice Bailey claimed to be in communication with these Ascended Masters, and they were giving her secret revelations about the coming world order. And one of the books that her and her demons wrote was called Education in the New Age. You should read it, since the World Core curriculum is based on their ramblings. They said that the world citizenship should be the goal of the enlightened with a world federation and a world brain. So we got to fuse Marxism with neo-scholasticism, and we're going to do it using the freely chosen cooperative methods of John Dewey. What does that have to do with us? Well, you guys remember Bill Gates? In 2004, he went over to the UNESCO headquarters and signed an international agreement with him on behalf of Microsoft. They said, we're going to create a global curriculum, global standards, global teacher training programs, and global technological systems to make it all work. You're thinking, no, they wouldn't, right? And a couple of years after that, Bill Gates came back to America, and then he poured $2.3 billion into what we call Common Core. Think they're related? Well, let me show you this video. It's Common Core propaganda from the people who created Common Core. So you don't have to believe me. Here's what they say.
Up till now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. Is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too.
Match up against international standards too. You see Seattle, Chicago, Shanghai, and Paris. All the kids are learning the same garbage. That's them bragging about it, folks, not me. And so now we're at the end. Obviously, we have a problem. And so now I'm just going to give you a couple minutes on solutions. I'll give you a minute of my opinion. You can throw it all right in the trash if you want. I'm sure you all have opinions too. And then after that, I'll give you a minute of God's opinion. Don't throw that one in the trash. And then we'll wrap up and have a break. So the question is, can we reform the system? And I would submit to you that the answer is obviously no. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do, right? It's turning your kids into anti-American Marxist revolutionaries who hate God, who hate their family, and hate their country. That's what it was designed to do. So we need to look at the public school building like it's on fire. And if the building's on fire and your children are inside, what do? You write a petition. Like you guys have kids then, all right? So you don't write a petition, right? And you know, I'm not against people running for school board and stuff, but obviously the building's on fire, and that's not even a good analogy. You run in and you get your children out. And I say it's not a good analogy because a fire is just going to hurt your children physically. And you know, that's bad enough, but there are things worse than death. Right? These schools are destroying your children physically, morally, academically, intellectually, spiritually, in every possible way. You've got to get them out, folks. That's the only answer. Pastors, priests, rabbis should be warning about this. Really good news. Thank you, COVID. Millions of children left the system in the last year. When I started telling people to get their kids out, they're like, what? Well, now Rush Limbaugh 3 times before he died said, parents, you got to get your kids out. Franklin Graham, top evangelical in the world, said, parents, you got to get your kids out. Donald Trump said multiple times in his last year in office, we have to protect our children from these failing government schools. And so now I'm going to just give you some quick insight into what God says, and we'll wrap it up. God says in Proverbs 22:6, who should be in charge of raising the children? God says Caesar should train up the children in the way that he should go. You guys are laughing. Of course he didn't say that, right? Parents, you're supposed to train up your children in the way that they should go. And Deuteronomy, you parents, you should teach God's laws to your children all the time. When you wake up, when you go to sleep, when you're eating, when you're walking by the way, there's no time for Caesar to brainwash them, okay? Got to raise them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And you know, God doesn't outline a full educational program. He doesn't tell you how many hours of science you need each year, but he does give you the basics. And the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, the most foundational element, the very beginning of wisdom, and the beginning of knowledge, by the way. How much fear of the Lord are they giving the kids in school? 0, right? That means there's no wisdom and there's no knowledge. And without knowledge, we're destroyed. Okay, Jesus made it real simple for us. Give Caesar the things that are Caesar's and God the things that are God's. So if your children belong to Caesar, by all means, put them back on that bus and see what happens. If your children belong to God, it's time to take action. And then one more very simple litmus test God gave us. Whoever's not with me is against me. There's 2 options. And I always say, open mic, anybody want to come up here and argue that the schools are with Christ? Never get any takers. Obviously, they're not, right? So homeschooling is amazing. All these men here were primarily homeschooled. They built the greatest, freest country in the history of the world. Great news on the homeschool front. We've got more than 5 million. They're acing all the government's tests. They're winning all the science fairs. Great Christian schools for parents who can't join. Some resources here if you want to share this information. I've got some DVDs of this presentation, some books with some more information. We've started a new ministry now, Public School Exit. Go to publicschoolexit.com if you want information on how to get the kids out. We'll come help your church set up a school or a co-op, whatever it is. We'll even give a scholarship if the parents can't afford it. And we need to recognize they're coming for our educational freedom. The UN passed a resolution in 2015 saying government needs to get control of all these private schools. In New York, they want to shut down the Jewish schools. These guys want to ban homeschooling. Harvard law professor and William and Mary law professor, folks, that's coming. I lived in Sweden when the government banned homeschooling. They started breaking down people's doors. They started going on airplanes to kidnap children from families that were fleeing this atrocity. It's coming here. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but it's coming. So we need to be ready. They're brainwashing, they're dumbing down, but hey, we got our AR-15s. We're gonna defend our freedom. And you know, I'm a gun guy too, and they'll take my guns for my cold dead hands. But guess what, guys? They don't need your guns. They've got your kids. That's all they need. Okay. And I just want to leave you with this scripture here because obviously it's not a political problem. It's not an educational problem. It's not just bad guys we're dealing with. I hope it's pretty obvious by now. But God says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. That's what's going on, folks. And we can stop it by pulling our children out and giving them a decent education. Thank you, guys. I think we're going to go to break, and God bless you all.